Imagine, if you will, a dog. Specifically, a dog in a laboratory in St. Petersburg in the 1920s.
Setting the scene, I like it.
Right. So this dog has been meticulously taught that a luminous circle, projected onto a screen means food is coming. And an oval shape means, well, absolutely nothing.
And it learns this rule perfectly, yeah.
Exactly. But then the researchers, they start playing a trick. Day by day, they slowly start making the oval rounder and rounder.
So the distinction gets harder.
Right. The ratio goes from 2 to 1 to 3 to 2 and so on. Finally, at a ratio of, I think it's 9 to 8, the dog's visual cortex simply cannot differentiate between the two shapes. The discrimination is impossible.
Which is where it gets fascinating. Because what happens next?
Well, the dog doesn't just sit there looking, mildly confused. It suffers a complete nervous breakdown. It tears at its harness. It barks frantically, loses control of its bowels. I mean, the whole system just shatters.
It is a striking image to begin with, truly. Because it immediately forces us to confront our assumptions about how the mind handles conflicting data.
Which is exactly why we're starting there today. Welcome to the discussion, everyone. And for those of you listening, we are treating you as the third person in this intellectual journey we are embarking on today.
Absolutely. Today we are looking at a topic that, it underpins every single decision a mental health professional makes, whether they actually realize it or not.
Yeah. Psychiatry, at its absolute core, is the study of how the brain, the mind, and human experience all interact. And crucially, it's the study of how that intricate, deeply personal process can go catastrophically wrong.
But, before anyone can attempt to treat a mind or even apply a diagnostic label to someone, they must first ask a deceptively profound question, which is, what actually is a mind?
Right. And that is our mission today. We are doing a thorough deep dive into Chapter 6.4 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
And we're attempting to move far beyond just mere empirical observation here. We want to step past the biological nuts and bolts of neurotransmitters and synaptic clefts.
Yeah, to examine the foundational philosophies and the psychological models that actually shape clinical reasoning today. I mean, this isn't an exercise in memorizing archaic theories.
No, not at all. It is about building robust mental models. It's about understanding the very architecture of psychiatric thought.
So, to build those models, we need a reliable way to conceptualize what we're looking at. And you brought up a brilliant metaphor earlier.
Yes, the cartographer's map. So let us consider the human mind as this vast, incredibly dense, entirely uncharted territory. Yep. The theories and philosophies we're going to explore today are essentially their maps. And when you look at a map, the information you get depends entirely on the projection the cartographer chose to use.
So if you look at a political map, for instance, you see distinct borders,
right,
rigid lines separating nations.
Exactly, which is directly analogous to our categorical diagnostic manuals in psychiatry, like the DSM. A patient either has a condition or they do not. They're inside the border or outside it.
Right, but if you look at a topographical map, you see peaks and valleys. It's a continuous flowing landscape.
Spot on. And that represents dimensional trait theories where, everyone has the same traits but just in varying degrees. Elevation, if you will.
And then, I suppose, if you consult a historical map, you see how the terrain was formed. Rivers, tectonic shifts over centuries.
Yes, which is your narrative in developmental psychology. But the crucial thing here is...
none of those maps actually are the territory itself.
Exactly. A topographical map doesn't contain actual dirt and rock. The human mind is infinitely complex, entirely too multifaceted to be perfectly captured by one single two-dimensional drawing.
But each projection, each specific theoretical map, allows a clinician to navigate a completely different kind of terrain, depending on what the patient sitting right in front of them desperately needs.
Because the terrain absolutely must dictate the tool. Pluralism isn't just some academic luxury. It is a clinical necessity.
Yeah, you can't navigate a rugged mountain range using only a map that shows political borders.
You'd walk right off a cliff because the tool you're using is completely blind to elevation.
I love that. All right, let us start looking at the bedrock then, because long before we had, fMRI scanners or genetic sequencing to show us the physical terrain of the brain, ancient thinkers had to deduce the architecture of the mind purely through observation.
They had to look at human behavior, societal structures, and essentially reverse engineer the psyche.
And the first major map maker we encounter here is Plato, writing around, 400 BCE?
Roughly, yeah. And in his monumental work, The Republic, Plato attempts this fascinating conceptual leap. He compares the constitution of a functioning state to the internal constitution of the human soul.
Right. He divides the soul into three distinct parts, doesn't he? Appetites, passions, and reason.
Yes, and this is highly relevant to contemporary clinical practice, despite it being so ancient.
Really? How so?
Well, Plato argued that just as a stable state requires, peasants to provide resources, soldiers for defense, and wise philosopher kings to rule.
A healthy human mind requires appetites for basic biological survival, passions for drive, and reason to govern them all.
Exactly. Mental health, in his conceptualization, is achieved only when reason successfully holds the passions and the appetites in a harmonious check.
I mean, I'm trying to square that with modern diagnostics, though, because it sounds a bit like he just took a rigid social caste system and arbitrarily projected it onto human neuroanatomy.
It does sound like that at first glance, but the text suggests he actually formulated one of the very first concepts of a personality disorder using this exact framework.
Wait, really? What does it look like when those three elements completely fail to balance?
He described a state he called the despotic man. Plato theorized that when reason is completely disregarded and overthrown, you get this toxic combination of inherent nature and learned habit.
Bringing together, what did you say, drunkenness, lust, and lunacy?
Yes. And you reach a state of severe psychopathology. The appetites become a tyrant within the mind.
Oh, wow. So if you walk into a psychiatric emergency department today, you will frequently see this exact presentation.
Absolutely. It is a stunningly accurate early description of what we recognize now as severe impulse control disorders or certain cluster B personality disorders, like severe antisocial personality disorder.
Because the executive function, the reason, has entirely lost its governing authority, and the individual is driven entirely by immediate destructive gratification.
Precisely. It holds up remarkably well. It's almost a precursor to the prefrontal cortex trying to regulate the limbic system.
That's brilliant. But then his student, Aristotle, arrives on the scene and offers a completely different map.
He does. Aristotle gives us the Nicomachean Ethics, and his paramount contribution to this field is the concept of the golden mean.
Right. So he moves away from the idea of different parts of the soul warring with each other, and instead looks at single traits operating on a spectrum.
Yes, he engaged in this immense, detailed cataloging of human character, courage, temperance, generosity. But his defining argument was that pathology is fundamentally an extreme deviation from a normal baseline.
So an extreme standing on either end of a trait dimension is a vice or a pathology, whereas the middle ground is the virtue.
Exactly.
Let me put an analogy to this just to see if the mechanism holds, because this reminds me of an audio mixing desk.
Oh, I like where this is going. Go on.
So think of Aristotle's golden mean like an analog audio mixing desk in a recording studio. Every human trait is a single fader, a slider on that desk.
Okay, right.
Take the slider for, say, the desire for social attachment and attention. You push that slider up just a little bit, putting some of that treble into the mix, and it gives the music life. You get healthy relationships, charisma, social cohesion.
Yes, the virtue.
But if you push that slider entirely to the top, hitting the absolute red line maximum, you get unbearable, blown-out distortion.
And clinically, that distortion maps perfectly onto histrionic personality disorder.
Right. An excessive, overwhelming need for social attention that actually destroys the person's ability to function.
The mechanism holds perfectly. And, if we follow that same logic in reverse, pulling that exact same slider all the way down to absolute zero, the track sounds completely dead. There's no resonance, no life.
And that extreme deficit maps directly onto schizoid personality disorder, where there's an insufficient concern for social attachments, a total lack of desire for interpersonal connection.
It is the exact same underlying trait, just manifesting at opposite pathological extremes.
That makes so much sense.
Furthermore, Aristotle distinguished between temperance, which is having healthy, moderate impulses that require very little conscious effort to manage and self-control, which he defined as having wild, immoderate appetites that an individual is basically white-knuckling to hold in check.
That level of nuanced conceptual analysis directly anticipates the empirical taxonomies we use in modern behavioral science.
It really does.
So we have Plato and Aristotle giving us the structural, almost mechanical views of the mind, which feel very foundational to Western science. But the textbook deliberately takes us east at this point.
Yes. Introducing a radically different projection of the map. We examine Shankara, an 8th century Hindu philosopher.
How does his view of the mind contrast with the Greeks? Because it seems like quite a pivot.
Well, Eastern philosophy, particularly Shankara's articulation of Advaita Vedanta, which heavily influenced mainstream Hinduism, offers a profound paradigm shift.
In what way?
In Western thought, the focus is almost exclusively on fixing the individual within the material world. We view the self as an independent, discrete entity that needs to be repaired.
Right. We are a broken machine that needs fixing.
Exactly. But Shankara argued that the fundamental underlying basis of all existence is Brahman, the absolute. He said the physical universe is not necessarily an illusion, but the deeply held conviction that your individual self, your ego, your mind is separate from that material world, separate from Brahman, is the ultimate illusion.
Okay, and I have to ask this from a practical standpoint. If the self is an illusion, how on earth does a modern psychiatrist sit across from a patient who is suffering from severe panic attacks and utilize that map?
It's a fair question.
I mean, if a patient comes in just wanting their anxiety gone so they can go back to work, telling them their identity is a cosmic illusion feels incredibly unhelpful, possibly even dismissive.
It definitely seems contradictory until you look at what it does to the ultimate goal of treatment.
Okay, how so?
Western psychiatry is predominantly focused on the palliation of distress. We want to reduce symptoms so a person can function effectively in their social group, maintain their employment, and sustain their family life.
Right. It's about restoring the cog so the machine keeps running.
Precisely. But Eastern philosophy, which, it's worth noting, heavily influenced psychoanalysts like Carl Jung, by the way, argues that the goal shouldn't merely be palliation.
What should it be?
The goal is complete liberation from the illusions that are causing the distress in the first place. It is a pursuit of self-transcendence, of profound detachment from ego-driven suffering.
So it's a map where the final destination is not just functional, but enlightened.
Exactly. It challenges the clinician to ask whether the patient's suffering is a disease to be cured or a spiritual wake-up call to be answered.
It certainly highlights the limitations of the Western model. I mean,
Yep.
It makes one wonder if our clinical map is far too focused on just getting people back onto the treadmill of modern life, rather than pausing to ask if the treadmill itself is the root cause of the pathology.
Which naturally brings us to a Western philosopher who had an incredibly dark, deterministic view of that very treadmill, Arthur Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer. He is a pivotal historical figure in this lineage, isn't he?
He really is. Writing in the 19th century, he exerted an extraordinary influence on early personality theorists, including Sigmund Freud.
And Schopenhauer observed human behavior and reached a conclusion that directly attacked the central optimistic belief of Western thought. The belief that human happiness or misery is dictated by external conditions.
What we routinely measure today as quality of life.
Right. The classic societal narrative. If I secure that major promotion, or, if I move to a bigger house in a better neighborhood, or if I finally find the right partner, I will finally be sustainably happy.
And Schopenhauer completely rejected that premise. He prophesied that a person's measure of pain and well-being is determined once and for all by their very nature, their intrinsic temperament.
He argued forcefully that wealth, power, and prestige do not make people inherently happy.
Yes, noting that he observed just as many cheerful faces among the destitute as he did among the aristocracy.
That's quite the observation for the 1800s.
He proposed a psychological mechanism, actually. He said, if you somehow magically removed a major crushing source of suffering from a person's life, they would simply find 100 minor annoyances to take its place, quickly returning them to their characteristic baseline of misery.
Wow. And what is genuinely astonishing about this is that modern behavioral genetics and longitudinal psychological research have robustly confirmed Schopenhauer's observational philosophy.
They absolutely have.
But wait, that is an incredibly bleak assessment. Are you saying that therapeutic interventions are basically futile if our misery baseline is permanently locked in?
It sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah. How does modern psychiatry justify attempting to treat major depressive disorder if Schopenhauer was entirely right? It sounds like biological destiny.
It is a sobering reality, I'll give you that. But it doesn't render therapy futile. Rather, it manages clinical expectations. The modern research into the hedonic treadmill shows that subjective well-being is indeed highly tethered to enduring personality traits. People possess a biological baseline of affect. If an individual wins the lottery, they experience immense elation temporarily. But processes of neurological and psychological adaptation ruthlessly kick in. And within a year, they return to their previous characteristic baseline.
Oh, wow. So therapy isn't about transforming a melancholic temperament into a chronically euphoric one, because that's impossible.
Exactly. It's about providing tools to prevent that baseline from dipping into catastrophic, life-threatening clinical depression and helping the patient extract meaning despite their inherent temperament.
That is a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
So we have this landscape of biological and structural certainty being built. Traits are hardwired. The baseline is set. But just as we get comfortable with that, the textbook throws a massive, disorienting postmodern curveball into the mix.
Yes. We are introduced to Jacques Derrida, the deconstructionists, and the concept of social constructionism.
Postmodernism, which provides a radical, necessary critique of the empirical science we just discussed.
It does. Philosophers like Derrida and in the psychiatric sphere, figures like Thomas Szasz ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the very tools we use to define illness.
What's the question?
Well, social constructionists argue that there is no pristine, objective reality out there for science to neutrally study. Instead, they assert that what we confidently call reality, or what we label as mental illness, is fundamentally constructed.
Constructed by what?
It is a product of our specific language, our historical era, and our cultural power structures.
Let me try to translate this into a concrete analogy just to make sure I'm following.
Please do.
To a postmodernist, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is less like a periodic table of objective, unchanging elements and more like a dictionary of contemporary slang.
That is an excellent way to grasp the critique, yes.
Because it only has power and meaning. Because a specific group of people with authority in a specific era all agreed on the definitions. But those definitions could completely change in the next century.
Exactly. They argue that scientific categorization is inextricably bound to hidden value judgments. Now, Thomas Szasz famously and highly controversially argued that mental illnesses are not objective medical conditions at all, but rather questionable ethical judgments disguised as medical facts.
Right. And I should note for the listener, we are strictly reporting on Szasz's perspective here as it's presented in the text, not endorsing it or taking a side. It's a highly debated viewpoint.
Quite right. And mainstream clinical psychiatry tends to view extreme postmodernism with considerable skepticism. We possess empirical evidence of the profound biological basis for conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They are not mere linguistic constructs.
Of course.
However, the postmodern map is vitally important because it enforces institutional humility. It reminds clinicians that tools like the DSM-5 are profoundly imperfect human constructs. They are maps that are continually in need of revision.
Yeah, because if we arrogantly ignore cultural context, our supposedly objective science can inadvertently pathologize normal cultural variations and oppress vulnerable patients. Spot on. All right, so if philosophy tells us what the map is made of, whether it's constructed of rigid biological destiny or fluid cultural language, psychology attempts to actually measure the distances on that map.
Perfect transition. Let's move firmly into mechanisms and models.
How does a mind actually acquire its complex patterns? Are we fundamentally a programmable machine reacting to inputs, or are we an organism inherently striving for intrinsic growth?
Let us start by looking at the machine, the behavioral paradigm.
The behavioral movement, spearheaded early on by John B. Watson, right, and later brought to its zenith by B.F. Skinner.
Yes, and it was a violent, uncompromising reaction against the introspection, mentalism, and psychoanalysis of the time. Skinner was a radical behaviorist. He preferred to study what he called the empty organism.
The empty organism. That is quite a phrase.
To Skinner, the subjective mind didn't even exist in a scientifically useful or measurable way. Attempting to study unconscious desires was as unscientific as studying ghosts.
So personality in this map is not a soul, nor is it a complex neuropsychic structure. It's merely a repertoire of behaviors imparted by a lifetime history of environmental reinforcement.
Exactly. You simply are what you have been conditioned to be.
It is an incredibly reductionist, almost cold map of human existence. But to be fair, it provided clinicians with some incredibly powerful, actionable explanations for severe pathology.
It did. Instead of viewing mental illness as a deeply mysterious spiritual crisis or an unmeasurable unconscious conflict, they framed it simply as faulty learning.
Which brings us back to Ivan Pavlov's laboratory and the concept of experimental neuroses. We touched on the dog with the circle and the oval right at the beginning.
We did.
Mechanically, why does the inability to discriminate shapes cause a total systemic breakdown?
Well, Pavlov's work with those dogs is foundational because it demonstrates the physiological limits of conditioned learning. The breakdown at the 9:8 oval to circle ratio occurred because the organism's neurological system was placed in an impossible double bind.
Right. The dog was highly motivated by hunger to respond to the food stimulus, highly
Yeah.
motivated to inhibit response to the non-food stimulus.
Yes. When the environmental cues became entirely ambiguous, the conflicting excitatory and inhibitory neurological signals essentially short-circuited the brain.
Wow.
And Pavlov proposed that human neuroses might have exact parallel causes. Human nervous systems breaking down when forced by their environment to navigate impossible, highly consequential discriminations over long periods.
That really moves us from abstract psychoanalysis into observable biology. And then John Dollard and Neil Miller came along. He did something genuinely fascinating.
They really did. They took the deep, murky, highly theoretical concepts of Freudian psychoanalysis and forced them through the cold, hard terminology of learning theory.
Let's take Freud's concept of repression as an example, because Freud viewed it as this complex, unconscious hydraulic system keeping dangerous desires buried. How did Dollard and Miller translate that into a purely behavioral mechanism?
They stripped away the hydraulics entirely and looked purely at stimulus and response. Dollard and Miller proposed that repression is simply a thought that happened to elicit an extreme state of anxiety.
Okay.
Because the brain automatically blocking or stopping that thought resulted in an immediate reduction of the noxious anxiety, the internal act of blocking the thought was powerfully negatively reinforced.
Ah, so it's not an ego defense mechanism in the Freudian sense at all. It is simply an internal avoidance behavior that became a deeply ingrained habit through operant conditioning.
Precisely.
I want to pause on negative reinforcement, actually, because I feel it is one of the most misunderstood terms in popular psychology.
Yeah.
People often think negative reinforcement means punishing someone.
Constantly. It's a huge misconception.
So mechanically, how does it actually drive pathology in, say, obsessive-compulsive disorder?
It is crucial to clarify that distinction. Punishment introduces a negative stimulus to stop a behavior. Negative reinforcement removes a negative stimulus to increase a behavior. This is the exact crucial mechanism in behavioral models of severe anxiety and compulsions. If a patient experiences terrifying, intrusive thoughts of contamination, their anxiety spikes dramatically.
So they engage in a compulsion, they wash their hands vigorously for 10 minutes.
Yes, and the moment they finish, the crushing anxiety temporarily drops. That sheer relief, that drop in anxiety, powerfully reinforces the hand-washing behavior.
The brain learns washing hands equals safety.
Exactly. The behavior becomes entirely self-perpetuating, locking the patient into a vicious cycle, even though it is completely maladaptive and destroys their daily functioning.
But the behavioral map had to evolve, didn't it? Because we aren't just empty organisms, and we aren't dogs staring at glowing shades.
No, we're not. Humans have complex language. We have anticipation. We have cognition.
And this necessity gave rise to the social cognitive evolution of learning theory.
Indeed. The radical behaviorist model was simply too rigid to capture human complexity. Theorists realized that humans do not merely react blindly to past reinforcements. We actively anticipate future ones based on complex cognitive models.
Enter Julian Rotter. He introduced a vital concept here called the locus of control.
Yes, which represents a person's generalized cognitive expectation of where rewards in life originate.
Right, so if an individual has a life history of personal agency and success, they develop an internal locus of control. They firmly believe their own actions directly dictate their outcomes.
Yeah, exactly.
Conversely, if a person has a history of severe systemic poverty or, repeated interpersonal trauma where they were powerless, they might develop an external locus of control.
Yes, they cognitively map the world as a place where everything is dictated by luck, fate, or the arbitrary whims of powerful others.
And no amount of standard conditioning is going to fix that without addressing the cognitive belief itself, surely.
Exactly, the limitation that was identified. And Albert Bandura brought in another critical cognitive element with self-efficacy.
Which is an individual's specific belief in their own capability to execute the behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments.
Right. Furthermore, Bandura empirically proved that we learn powerfully through vicarious modeling. We do not have to personally touch the burning stove to learn the avoidance behavior. We merely have to observe someone else burn their hand.
We cognitively simulate the reinforcement.
Yes. And then Hazel Marcus later expanded this cognitive architecture even further with the concept of possible selves.
The profound idea that we internalize entire future identities based on social messages and cognitive aspirations, which actively shape our current behavior.
Spot on. It's a huge step forward from the empty organism.
But not everyone in the psychological community was satisfied with this evolution either. Even with cognition added, it still viewed humans essentially as input-output processing systems.
True. And this dissatisfaction brings us to the humanistic rebellion.
Theorists like Gordon Allport, Abraham Maslow, and Carl Rogers, they fundamentally rejected the mechanistic view entirely, didn't they?
They did. They argued passionately for a proactive, rational, and profoundly meaning-driven human nature. The humanists posited that we are not simply striving to maintain homeostasis or avoid anxiety.
They believe that humans, unlike any other animal, are inherently striving for immense personal growth and actualization.
Carl Rogers is a monumental figure in this paradigm. He posited a core biological and psychological premise that all living organisms naturally tend towards self-actualization, a built-in drive to expand, extend, and develop.
But if that inherent drive to grow is so natural and universal, how does a humanistic map explain the development of severe pathology? Where does the machine break down if it's designed to continually upgrade itself?
Rogers argued that severe pathology occurs when that natural, intrinsic growth is defensively distorted by the environment. And the mechanism by which this tragedy unfolds is usually through what he termed conditions of worth.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Imagine a developing child. For survival, they absolutely require unconditional, positive regard love from their primary caregivers above all else. But if those parents only dispense love conditionally, when the child behaves in a highly specific, rigidly approved manner, for instance, aggressively withdrawing affection whenever the child expresses natural anger or sadness, the child is forced to internalize those conditions.
They subconsciously conclude, I am only a worthwhile, lovable human being if I completely suppress my anger.
Yes.
So, to maintain the vital attachment they need to literally survive childhood, they must violently distort their own true experiencing self. They bury a fundamental part of their human experience.
Exactly, and that creates a massive structural fault line in the psyche, generating deep chronic anxiety and leading to lifelong self-defeating behaviors.
It is an incredibly tragic mechanism. You are essentially forced to amputate parts of your own personality just to keep your attachments intact.
It is a profound conceptualization of trauma, honestly. Another fascinating theorist who looked at how we structure our internal reality was George Kelly.
Ah, yes. His theory of personal constructs. It's highly unique and sits somewhat between cognition and humanism, doesn't it?
It does. Kelly didn't view humans as being blindly driven by primal instincts, nor as mere reinforcement-seeking machines. He viewed every human being as an amateur scientist, constantly trying to predict and anticipate the world.
We build internal constructs, bipolar categories like friendly versus hostile or safe versus dangerous, to rapidly process the massive influx of sensory data we receive every second.
Precisely.
I want to focus closely on Kelly because his specific definition of anxiety is one of the most illuminating concepts in the entire textbook. Let us try another analogy here.
Go for it.
Imagine your mind is the operating system of a highly complex computer. Anxiety, in Kelly's specific theoretical view, is not a random neurochemical glitch. It is not an unprovoked misfire of the amygdala.
Right.
Anxiety is the absolute systemic panic the operating system experiences when it suddenly realizes that its current software, its entire deeply held construct system, is entirely inadequate to process the massive, novel amount of data it is suddenly receiving.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. If an individual's primary foundational construct is that the world is a completely safe, just, and predictable place, and they suddenly experience a random, brutal act of violence, their internal operating system crashes entirely.
Because the new, horrific data simply does not fit the existing software code.
Exactly. That acute awareness of systemic inadequacy, the realization that your map no longer matches the territory at all, is the very definition of anxiety.
Wow.
Furthermore, Kelly defined hostility in a uniquely brilliant way. Hostility is not just anger. Hostility is when an individual desperately tries to violently force the new contradictory data to fit into the old broken software.
Actively extorting evidence to prove their shattered worldview is still correct, rather than doing the painful work of updating their constructs.
Yes. It's a fascinating way to view resistance in therapy.
Which brings us inevitably to the search for profound meaning, which is arguably the ultimate humanistic pursuit. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist, he survived the unimaginable horrors of the Nazi concentration camps.
He did.
And from that absolute abyss of human suffering, he did not emerge a nihilist. He developed logotherapy.
Frankl's observations are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He observed firsthand that physical survival in those extreme, degrading conditions often hinged entirely on the possession of meaning.
Right.
He argued forcefully that humans possess a unique spiritual dimension that behaviorism completely ignores. We do not just blindly seek physical pleasure or avoid physical pain. We desperately seek purpose.
And when traditional societal structures of meaning collapse, or when an individual fails to find meaning in their suffering, they face what Frankl termed existential neuroses, a profound, crushing sense of despair, boredom, and alienation.
Pathology in this map is not a broken brain. It is a fundamental crisis of meaning.
And then Dan McAdams took these profound ideas regarding meaning and identity and translated them into modern empirical psychology by looking at personality fundamentally as a story.
Yes, McAdams proposed that personality doesn't just exist on one level, it exists on 3 distinct levels.
Level 1 consists of your basic biological traits. Level 2 encompasses your characteristic adaptations, like your specific goals, values, and coping skills.
But level 3 is the life narrative. It is the internalized, evolving story you constantly tell yourself to give your scattered life events a sense of unity and ultimate purpose.
Understanding level 3 is absolutely crucial for complex clinical reasoning, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. When a patient sits in a psychiatric evaluation and vividly, emotionally recounts a specific instance of childhood humiliation, McAdams would argue that the clinician should not simply view this memory as the direct linear cause of their current trauma in a mechanistic sense.
Right.
Rather, the clinician must understand that this memory has become a deeply held symbol of the patient's core identity. It serves as a narrative anchor.
A patient might have unconsciously constructed a narrative that casts them permanently as the eternal victim of a cruel world.
Or, conversely, as McAdams found incredibly common in his research on American populations, they might utilize the redemptive self narrative, where every single obstacle or trauma is interpreted merely as a necessary setup for an eventual triumphant comeback.
It's all about the story we tell ourselves.
Right.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of theoretical ground. We have explored the philosophical foundations defining the nature of the mind. We've looked deeply into the mechanisms of acquired behavior and the humanistic drive for meaning.
And now we must confront the physical reality. We move into clinical manifestations, trait models, and the 5-factor architecture.
Right, because we've discussed the fluid stories we tell ourselves and the malleable habits we learn. But what about the enduring, hardwired biological structures that make us who we are before the environment even touches us?
This transition brings us to the lexical hypothesis, which is the cornerstone of modern empirical personality science.
The underlying premise is remarkably elegant in its simplicity. If a specific personality trait is genuinely important to human social interaction and survival, every human language and culture will inevitably coin a specific word to describe it.
Exactly. And Gordon Allport initiated this monumental task by literally combing through an unabridged English dictionary and identifying approximately 4,000 distinct words describing human traits.
4,000 words, that's quite the list.
And for several subsequent decades, through the application of rigorous, highly complex statistical techniques, specifically factor analysis by researchers like Toops and Kurtal, and later the definitive work by Costa and McRae, those thousands of disparate words were mathematically boiled down to 5 fundamental dimensions.
Now, I want to clarify how that math actually works, because going from 4,000 words to just 5 traits sounds a bit like magic. Conceptually, how does factor analysis achieve that?
Think of factor analysis as looking for statistical gravity wells. You take a massive data set, thousands of individuals rating themselves and others on those thousands of adjectives.
Okay, a huge amount of data.
Yes. The computer looks for correlation matrices. It discovers that if a person is frequently described as talkative, well, they are also almost invariably described as energetic, outgoing, and assertive.
Right, they cluster together.
The mathematics clumps these highly correlated words together into one massive supercategory. When the math is applied across all languages and cultures, it turns out human personality predictably clusters around exactly 5 main gravity wells.
The 5-factor model, universally known as the Big 5. Neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. NEOAC.
Yes.
But the textbook specifies that these are not merely descriptive linguistic labels, correct?
Yes, sir.
The five-factor theory asserts that these are tangible biological realities.
That's a vital point. Yes, the explanatory theory built upon the model posits a highly specific biological mechanism. It asserts that our underlying biological bases, our inherited genetics, our brain structure, our neurochemistry, solely and exclusively dictate our basic tendencies, which are these 5 traits.
So the environment does not change your basic trait level.
No, it doesn't. These biologically fixed traits then constantly interact with environmental influences to generate our characteristic adaptations, which include our learned skills, our social roles, our personal relationships, and significantly, our susceptibility to psychological disorders.
One of the most surprising and frankly confrontational findings for many people encountering this research is discovering just how rigid and stable these traits actually are.
People don't like hearing it, do they?
Not at all. Popular culture is absolutely obsessed with the idea of the midlife crisis. The narrative that a highly conservative, 40-year-old conscientious accountant is suddenly going to undergo a radical transformation and become an impulsive, thrill-seeking, entirely different person.
But robust longitudinal studies completely obliterate that myth, don't they?
The empirical data absolutely destroys the myth of radical personality transformation. Massive longitudinal research demonstrates conclusively that after approximately the age of 30, personality traits demonstrate remarkable rank order stability. Okay, rank order stability.
Now, there are gradual...
Neuroticism is the massive foundational variable here, right? Which is the inherent biological tendency to readily experience negative effect, such as fear, anger, guilt, and sadness.
Yes. Consistently high neuroticism is a profound, non-specific risk factor for developing major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and borderline personality disorder. It operates as a generalized biological vulnerability to experiencing severe distress.
Theodore Mellon conducted pivotal work integrating this, didn't he? Demonstrating mathematically that what we call personality disorders are often just extreme combinations of normal traits.
Mellon's work was groundbreaking. Avoidant personality disorder, for example, is not necessarily a standalone disease. It is essentially a combination of very high neuroticism yielding extreme social anxiety and profound vulnerability combined simultaneously with very low extroversion, resulting in low gregariousness.
Which is precisely what allows clinicians to distinguish it perfectly from schizoid personality disorder.
Exactly. A schizoid individual also presents with very low extroversion. They simply do not seek out or enjoy social contact, but crucially, they have low neuroticism.
They are not secretly anxious about being alone. They are perfectly calm and genuinely prefer isolation.
Spot on. The avoidant individual, in stark contrast, desperately yearns for human connection, but is biologically terrified of the potential for rejection.
I have to push back heavily on the utility of the DSM here, then.
Please do. Many have.
If human personality traits exist at a continuous flowing spectrum, exactly like human height or blood pressure, isn't the entire practice of diagnosing a personality disorder as a rigid categorical box conceptually absurd?
It is a huge issue.
I mean, it feels logically equivalent to a doctor diagnosing a patient with a rare medical disease called tallness simply because they happen to be over 6'5".
Your critique is exactly the argument that incited a ferocious 12-year academic and political battle during the exhaustive creation of the DSM-5.
12 years.
Yes. The traditional categorical model, where a patient either strictly meets the criteria for the disorder or they do not, simply does not fit the biological reality of continuous traits.
Right.
The Scientific Personality and Personality Disorders Work Group actually proposed a highly sophisticated dimensional model, heavily based on the 5-factor model, to entirely replace the outdated categories. This radical shift was strongly endorsed by the Scientific Task Force.
But despite the scientific endorsement, that dimensional model didn't actually make the final cut into the main manual, did it? What happened?
In a highly controversial, heavily criticized move, the American Psychiatric Association Board of Trustees effectively overruled their own scientific task force.
Oh, really?
Yes. They chose to retain the 10 rigid categorical personality disorders that we've relied on for decades, and they relegated the new scientifically validated dimensional model to Section 3, the Emerging Measures and Models section at the back of the book.
The back of the book, wow. What was the justification for that?
The administrative justification was that practicing clinicians needed more time to acclimate to such a radical paradigm shift. but it starkly highlights the immense ongoing tension between the map of actual empirical scientific reality and the map of practical, administrative, billing-driven psychiatry.
That is a staggering piece of psychiatric history. It shows how the map is drawn not just by science, but by committee politics.
Indeed.
Well, we have covered an immense expanse of conceptual territory. We have established the philosophical bedrock, dissected the mechanisms of learning and meaning, and mapped the biological traits. Now we arrive at the most critical juncture, integration and clinical reasoning.
The application phase.
Yes. How does a working clinician actually apply this dense theoretical framework to therapy when sitting face-to-face with a patient in severe distress?
The hallmark of clinical excellence comes down to successfully tailoring the specific intervention to the exact theoretical terrain of the patient's individual map.
So if a clinician assesses that the patient's primary issue is rooted in the behavioral map, the therapeutic approach is highly direct. Curing the immediate symptom is curing the disease. There is no search for hidden meaning.
Exactly. If a patient presents with a debilitating specific phobia, the clinician will utilize learning theory. They might employ systematic desensitization, slowly, incrementally exposing the patient to the feared stimulus while teaching them incompatible relaxation techniques.
Or they might use implosive therapy or flooding, where the patient is exposed to the feared object at maximum intensity without the physical ability to escape.
Yes. This prevents the avoidance behavior from being negatively reinforced, eventually extinguishing the autonomic fear response entirely.
But if we shift the lens and look at the patient through the humanistic map, the intervention required is fundamentally entirely different.
Completely different. It is no longer about extinguishing a reflex. It is about reframing the patient's narrative and restoring their sense of conscious agency.
Frankel's logotherapy provides us with an absolutely amazing counterintuitive clinical example of this, with a technique called paradoxical intention. He leverages the uniquely human capacities for self-distancing and profound humor to break pathology.
The clinical application of paradoxical intention is brilliant. The classic textbook example involves treating a patient who suffers from severe, debilitating stuttering.
Right. Mechanically, the stuttering is massively exacerbated and maintained by the immense, crushing anticipatory anxiety the patient feels regarding trying not to stutter in public.
The harder they try to suppress it, the worse the physiological tension becomes and the worse they stutter.
So Frankel, subverting this entirely, would instruct the patient to actively try to stutter as violently, loudly, and aggressively as humanly possible during their next conversation.
And by ordering the patient to deliberately perform the very act they are terrified of, it completely short-circuits the anticipatory anxiety.
The patient invariably finds that they actually cannot stutter on command because the destructive feedback loop of fear has been severed. It brilliantly uses human paradox and cognitive reframing against the mechanical behavioral symptom.
It really is an elegant technique. But perhaps the most elegant, complex application of theory to therapy we see in this entire chapter is trait-based clinical reasoning.
Yes. Specifically, looking at how clinicians utilize crossover analysis in marital therapy using the five-factor model, as pioneered and detailed by researchers Piedmont and Rogerson.
This is a perfect place to see mechanism in action. Let us walk through the specific scenario detailed in the text.
You have a husband and wife sitting in a marital counseling session on the brink of divorce. They are each instructed to fill out a comprehensive Big Five personality inventory for themselves, and crucially, they then fill one out detailing how they perceive their spouse.
Right, and the volatile clinical scenario presents as follows. Based on the inventories, the wife rates her husband as being extremely low on openness to experience and low on conscientiousness.
So from her perspective, she sees him as emotionally closed off, utterly unwilling to discuss deep feelings, disengaged, and somewhat selfish in his lack of planning.
Meanwhile, looking at the husband's forms, he rates his wife as being exceptionally low on neuroticism and low on agreeableness.
He basically conceptualizes her as this incredibly emotionally cold, highly stable, hostile antagonist who is constantly yelling at him, ruthlessly criticizing his actions, and deliberately attacking his masculinity.
It sounds like an irreconcilable conflict, but here is the profound clinical reality revealed by the data of the crossover analysis. The husband's perception of his wife's traits is fundamentally biologically wrong.
How so?
The wife is not an emotionally stable, hostile antagonist. The data show she actually scores extremely high on her own self-report of neuroticism.
So she is highly insecure, flooded with chronic anxiety, and desperately yearning for emotional reassurance and support from him.
This dynamic is incredibly common. So her constant yelling and criticism isn't a calculated, hostile attack born of malice. It is a desperate, highly maladaptive, panic-driven plea for emotional succor.
She is terrified the relationship is failing.
Yes, but the husband, lacking the psychological literacy to accurately recognize her high neuroticism, misinterprets her frantic panic as pure antagonism. He feels he is under vicious attack.
So what is his behavioral response? He physically and emotionally withdraws to protect his own ego.
Which is the absolute most destructive action he could possibly take, because the moment he withdraws, her baseline anxiety skyrockets even further, confirming her worst fears of abandonment.
And this severe spike in anxiety leads to even more intense frantic yelling.
Yeah.
Which in turn leads to even further withdrawal from the husband.
It is a rapid, catastrophic death spiral driven entirely by mutual misinterpretation of biological traits.
So as the clinician sitting in the room watching this unfold, what is the actual clinical utility here? How does the trait map stop the divorce?
By physically showing the couple their differing trait maps on paper, the clinician completely removes the toxic element of moral blame from the room.
Oh, that's powerful.
The therapist can authoritatively say, look at the data. You are not malicious individuals actively trying to destroy each other. Your underlying neuropsychic structures are simply misinterpreting the behavioral data you are receiving.
So the husband is taught to structurally reframe her yelling as a distress signal of extreme fear rather than a declaration of hatred.
And the wife learns that his emotional withdrawal is a defensive reaction to perceived attack, not a cold lack of love. It radically reframes the entire chaotic dynamic objectively and empathetically.
It provides them with the specific vocabulary necessary to finally understand each other's emotional needs based on their actual hardwired biological traits rather than their assumed motives.
It is just an incredibly powerful, deeply humane way to utilize a complex psychological model in a real, messy human situation. It pulls the theory entirely out of the textbook and saves a marriage.
We have covered an extraordinary amount of material today. Navigating from ancient Greece to modern statistical modeling, let us pull all of this conceptual architecture together into our key takeaways.
If we carefully synthesize the intellectual journey we have just undertaken, we clearly see that foundational philosophical assumptions, whether drawn from Plato's structural tripartite soul, Schopenhauer's grim biological determinism, or Eastern thought regarding the illusion of the ego, fundamentally dictate whether a modern clinician views a patient's profound distress as a systemic neurological dysfunction to be medicated, a biological destiny to be managed, or a mere illusion of the ego to be transcended.
The map dictates the meaning of the suffering.
Quite right.
Secondly, we explored how the behavioral and humanistic models provide the actual mechanisms of mind. A clinician must constantly ask, in this specific clinical presentation, are we attempting to systematically rewire faulty learning and maladaptive conditioned responses? Or are we striving to clear environmental blockages to free an inherent, natural drive toward meaning and self-actualization?
Thirdly, we established that trait theories, specifically the robust architecture of the five-factor model, provide the essential, empirically validated dimensional map. They prove beyond doubt that much of what psychiatry categorically labels as discrete pathology is, in fact, an extreme dimensional manifestation of highly stable, biologically rooted characteristics.
And finally, the overarching theme of this entire chapter is that true clinical excellence requires dedicated pluralism. A master psychiatrist does not simply pick one favorite theoretical map and arrogantly discard the rest.
They hold all of these maps simultaneously, the biological, the behavioral, the humanistic, the narrative, and the cultural, to dynamically and accurately navigate the uniquely complex terrain of the human being sitting right in front of them.
Precisely. Before we conclude this session, we must move into our required learning reinforcement phase.
Yes, we are going to rigorously test the mental models we just built with 5 specific single best answer style questions. I will read the conceptual question, we will pause briefly so you can actively formulate your answer, and then we will reveal the correct clinical reasoning.
Take a moment to mentally organize your maps. Let's begin the review.
Question 1. Which ancient philosophical concept most closely anticipates the modern dimensional approach to diagnosing personality disorders, wherein clinical pathology is fundamentally viewed as an extreme maladaptive variation of an otherwise normal human trait?
Take a beat to think about it. And the answer is Aristotle's concept of the golden mean, which posits that virtue lies in the moderate manifestation of a trait, while extreme deficits or excesses constitute vice or pathology.
Question 2. In George Kelly's humanistic and cognitive theory of personal constructs, How is the specific distressing emotion of anxiety theoretically defined?
Just a moment to recall the OS analogy. The answer is, anxiety is strictly defined as the profound awareness that one's existing construct system, the internal operating software used to predict the world, is completely inadequate for construing or processing important novel environmental events.
Question 3. According to empirical research utilizing the five-factor model, what specific trait combination best distinguishes avoidant personality disorder from schizoid personality disorder?
Think about the difference in neuroticism. And the answer is, both disorders feature exceptionally low extroversion, particularly low gregariousness. However, avoidant personality disorder is distinctly differentiated by the presence of exceptionally high neuroticism characterized by extreme social anxiety and vulnerability, whereas schizoid personality disorder features low neuroticism, indicating a calm preference for isolation.
Question 4. In classical behaviorist theory, what specific learning mechanism explains why a severe compulsion, such as repetitive hand-washing and OCD, is chronically maintained over time despite being obviously maladaptive to the individual's life?
Consider what happens when the action is completed. The answer is the compulsion is maintained because it is self-reinforcing. Performing the compulsive physical act immediately reduces the severe internal anxiety associated with not performing it, thereby powerfully negatively reinforcing the compulsive behavior through the removal of an aversive stimulus.
Question 5. According to massive longitudinal studies utilizing the five-factor model, what is the empirically expected trajectory of an individual's core personality traits after they reach the age of 30?
Think about the midlife crisis myth. And the answer is, the traits demonstrate predominant rank order stability. While minor normative mean level changes occur, profound foundational changes in personality structure are exceptionally rare, barring severe neurological trauma or neurodegenerative disease.
That concludes the review.
Before we sign off, consider this final, perhaps unsettling thought. If our core personality traits are indeed biologically fixed by age 30, and our conscious minds are merely complex construct systems desperately trying to process chaotic environmental data, who is the you that is actually doing the observing right now? If the map isn't the territory, what exactly happens to your sense of self when you step off the edge of the map entirely? Something to ponder as you continue your studies.
Thank you for taking this incredibly deep dive with us today. We highly encourage you to return to the textbook to explore these concepts in even greater detail.
Here are the details of this episode.
PSYCH 061. Approaches from Philosophy and Psychology.
Byline.
Before we treat the mind, we must ask what a mind is.